Hello, everybody. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through a document. Yes, this is like one of those books on audio, but video as well. And I'm going to discuss each point in the document in addition to just reading it. So this document is designed to help you write a research paper. Although I think people get the idea of what one is like, it's really hard for them to implement it in person to actually do it. So this document is designed to mimic a manuscript that you would submit for publication to a peer-reviewed journal. So it's got all the nuts and bolts in there as the expression goes. And I'm going to talk about what needs to go in each different section, although in addition, I'm also highlighting the areas that will act as headings. Anything that's not highlighted, you would not put in a paper. So let's get started. Okay, so this is for a professional manuscript. All manuscripts start with an introduction. However, it's important to note that when you're submitting something for publication, or if you're writing for a class or say a dissertation or whatever, you have specific guidelines to follow. If the guidelines state that you must use the heading introduction, then you would use it. But unless it's stated, I would not include a heading introduction. That's not generally what's done. Again, it depends on where you're submitting the paper. And by the way, we don't call them papers anymore. We call them manuscripts. Until it's published, it's a manuscript. So in this case, I'm dividing it like in an outline form, so that to help you write it better. But I would not, of course, have a heading that says introduction, or I definitely wouldn't have these Roman numerals here unless you're required to. And I'll add that some journals require you to also submit a manuscript with numbering. So you'd have numbering running up and down the side, so that a peer reviewer, a person who's reviewing your manuscript for potential publication, can actually identify where you need to make changes. But let's go on. So in this section, you provide data on the severity of the problem. Every single manuscript must start with the presentation of the problem. So you're trying to sell this manuscript to the publisher and to your audience, right? You're not writing it just for fun. You're writing it for a purpose. Even students who are in undergrad or grad courses, they're interested in some problem, so they're trying to make a case for why it's important. Sometimes you're required to by your instructors, but most people do research because they love doing it. This is a passion of theirs, or why would you spend money to be in higher education, right? So you have some problem that you're passionate about, and you want to make sure that people understand its severity. And if it's not severe, it may not be worth publishing. So this is where we learn about it. To talk about its severity. So in terms of epidemiologic data, like prevalence, incidence, what the consequences are. For if I was discussing COVID-19, I'd want to talk about the prevalence and how it's changed over time, and the probability of dying, right? The case fatality, if you get infected, what's the probability of dying? So, what's the hospitalization rate globally? I would present like globally we had this many cases. So this is a horrible problem, right? So you want to make sure that people understand the severity of the problem. And I note that you want to conclude the section with a sentence foretelling what will be if nothing is done. So you're kind of hinting towards the study's aims. And I give you some examples here, like again, I'm not doing any research on coronavirus myself at this moment, but this is just like an example of something that I just made up for this example here. It's an example. I made up this example for this video and for this document. So despite the increased spread of SARS coronavirus 2 and the proliferation of variants that increase susceptibility to infection, little is known about the impact of public service initiatives on vaccine hesitancy. So this would, for instance, be a study where we're looking at the relation between public service announcements on vaccine hesitancy. So I was talking about how despite the horrific nature of this problem, we don't really know anything about the impact of public service announcements or initiatives on vaccine hesitancy. Because vaccine hesitancy is a problem. Okay, so I'm hinting at the aim of the study. So now the next part is the literature review. This first part that we talked about, you do need to cite your sources. And I'm not putting any sources within here, but I will show you how to cite sources at the end of this document. But you do need sources. When you're dealing with epidemiologic data, generally you're relying on sources like the CDC or World Health Organization, also known as WHO, and other such sources, because they give you the most important numbers, right? Sometimes you'll use peer-reviewed journals as well for that, because in some cases, like for instance, if we're talking about the relation between infection and death, you may have a study that showed that versus data from, say, the CDC. So then you would cite that as well. So major issue in the literature review is when writers introduce research question prematurely. Yeah, this is actually a good problem. Continue your writing, but shift the focus to public service announcements and vaccine hesitancy at the end of the entire literature review. Once you have made your case for the importance of assessing the relation between the two, you introduce your research question. So you'll see this below. So what I'm talking about here is that there's a tendency for a lot of students to, basically they want to meet the requirements of the assignment to get a good grade. So they misinterpret what is needed. The research question does not come essentially till the end of the entire introduction section. So if you look at any good document, any good publications, this is a manuscript that has actually been published in a peer-reviewed journal, a journal that's reviewed by one's peers, it goes through this peer review process, you'll notice that the last paragraph, last few sentences are where the aim of the study is explained. Sometimes you have the researcher talking about the hypothesis. They might say, we hypothesize, etc. But they don't introduce it prematurely. There's no need to do that. Sometimes I see students repeating the hypotheses over and over again. That's not necessary. A good article should be very smooth, and I should be able to read it, or a manuscript, I should say, I should be able to read it in a very, very smooth fashion. I shouldn't have any hiccups at all when I'm reading. So as I'm an associate editor for a journal right now, and when I read manuscripts, I like them to read smoothly. I really don't want to read anything that's going to cause me to say, what? Because if that happens, that reduces the likelihood that the manuscript will proceed to publication. So as you do your literature review, you want to break it down into your variables. So every study has variables. So for instance, if we're looking at the impact of public service announcements on vaccine hesitancy, we can call our public service announcement variable the independent variable, and our vaccine hesitancy variable the dependent variable. Hopefully you know what a variable is. I shouldn't be assuming that. But a variable varies. So it's something that, like for instance, public service announcements, did you see a public service announcement, yes or no? There's variation in the answer. Some people say yes, some people say no. Not everybody's saying no or yes, right? So there's variation, and that's what variability is about. So we break it down and discuss our independent variable, what is known about it, be thorough, what do we know about public service announcements, their history, etc., and how they work with other diseases. What is unknown about it? Well, if there's nothing unknown about it, that's not good, because there's obviously a gap in the literature. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing the study. So we look for gaps. As you're reading, you should be asking yourself questions. By the way, as you're reading, you may find, and this is a good point that I have at point 2b, you may find that what you're planning to do has already been done. Oh, it's like, well, everybody's doing this. So if everybody's doing it, there's no need for you to do it. Unless you can find some kind of something missing in the research, like you find a flaw in it. So where you start off with one research question after reading the literature, and this is why it's so good to read the literature, you may find some gaps and alter your research question. You do a literature review on the dependent variable, in this case, vaccine hesitancy. What do we know about vaccine hesitancy? Over 2020 to 2022, we've seen a lot of 2022 today. Happy New Year. We see a lot of literature coming out on vaccine hesitancy related to COVID. Before, it was vaccine hesitancy related to other vaccines. So prior to COVID, we would have been picking up on those other articles because there hasn't been enough done. But as time has come, more and more articles have been done on it. But again, we're going to look for gaps. We're looking for gaps in that literature. And finally, you want to link the two together, right? So if there is no literature linking the two together, and you've made a really good case for why this is an important study, good for you. You hit something really, really nice. So look for anything that's out there, that any literature that links the two together. And again, look for gaps in the literature. You need gaps that set up your research question. Sorry for saying it like that, but if you don't have any gaps there, now it depends on who you're writing for. If you're writing it for an academic course where the professor just wants to see that you know how to do a research paper, you don't need the most major gaps, but you'd like to find gaps. Or the gap could be that in your personal knowledge and you want to learn to be a good researcher. That's it. But if you're trying to publish this in a peer-reviewed journal, or if you're working on your dissertation, you need gaps in there. You need something that will make your study novel. One thing that could happen in looking at the research is you might find that the relation between the two, and notice I say relationship is for people, relation is for variables. You may find that there are other variables involved, what we call the third variable problem. Hopefully you know what that means. If you don't, that's what we call a confounding variable. Confounding variables are variables that are related both to the independent variable and the dependent variable, and somehow they cloud the relation between the two. So the relation between the independent and dependent variable may be what we call spurious, which means it's false because it's based on both of the variables being related to this third variable. So for instance, there could be some mediating variable, some variable through which the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable is channeled. Like if we're looking at the effect we're looking at the effect of public service announcements on vaccine hesitancy, something might be mediating that effect. Like you have, hours of, so you listen to, oh yeah, here you go. You listen to the radio, you hear a public service announcement, it changes your opinion about science, say beliefs or something, beliefs about the efficacy of science, and that affects your vaccine hesitancy. Sometimes we have to think about this stuff on the fly. I was just actually trying to think about this on the fly as a potential mediator. So that's a mediator variable. If you identify something, and sometimes you can identify these mediators by reading the literature. At the end of articles, when in the discussion section, you might find the researcher saying something like, okay, maybe we should investigate whether beliefs about science impact vaccine hesitancy. And you're thinking, I wonder if hearing public service announcement influences one's beliefs about the efficacy of science, and that decreases vaccine hesitancy. This light bulb goes off, right? And you're like, wow, I found something that might be a potential mediator. So if you have those mediators, you need to discuss them as well. So in your literature review, moderators are variables that influence the impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. So for instance, if the effect of public service announcements the effect of public service announcements on vaccine hesitancy differs for males and females, then we have moderation. In this case, biological sex would be an effect moderator. So here, let's see, I think I had an example. Do I have an example? Well, I'll put it, I have an example in here and I'll get to it in a second. So you may find that there are potential moderators, like you're reading the literature and you see that the effect is strong in females. You could say, wow, I wonder if sex is a moderator, or say socioeconomic status is a moderator, like the effect differs for people with high versus low socioeconomic status or whatever. But that may be an area that you're interested in. Like you may be a social justice researcher and you want to look at differences between different ethnic, racial groups. So you can use those as moderator. You could actually have moderated mediation, right? Where the mediated effect differs by some third, or in this case, fourth variable, right? Because the mediator would be a third variable. in any case, if you are using any of those, you need to include them in your literature review. The final part is where you add the research question. Again, no headings here. So you see it's not highlighted, so I don't want to see any headings, ever. So you put this at the end, right? And here's an example of a research question. I wrote this about a week ago or so I'm excited to see what I came up with. For instance, you could write something like this: that said, that said indicates that I'm following from the prior sentence, right? So this is what I said. This is at the end of your document. That said, we propose that public service announcements decrease vaccine hesitancy, and the difference is moderated by participant sex. See, that's my idea, right? More specifically, look at this. So this is, now I'm getting into the specifics. So I'm going to talk about the hypothesis here. More specifically, viewing a public service announcement on the importance of vaccination against the coronavirus will result in an increased willingness to get vaccinated among females, but not males. So you'll notice one thing. So this is actually a hypothesis. So it's something that's testable because I can fail this, right? So in hypothesis language, if you took stats, and God willing, everybody took stats, we have null and alternative hypotheses. This is your alternative hypothesis. But notice I don't write null and alternative hypothesis. That's only in your head, right? Keep that in your head. I'm writing this for publication. I want people to be able to read this. So I explain it. I also, you'll notice I'm very specific in my definitions, like viewing a public service announcement. So that means viewing. There must be something visual. Has to be on the importance of vaccination against the coronavirus, will result in an increased willingness to get vaccinated. So this is being measured by something. There's some scale that's measuring willingness to get vaccinated, right? So I'm very, very specific. So I could fail this. What if I find that it works for males and not females? So I failed, right? So I'm taking a chance here. That's what research is about. So I didn't use any headings. So you notice it's also not highlighted. I told you I'm going to highlight the headings, and here's our highlight. So we highlight method section and participants and procedures, and this will vary depending on where you're submitting your manuscript. Like in some cases, this method section would have to be bold and in all caps. By the way, I'm using these numerical. These Roman numerals here just for this document. This doesn't mean you need Roman numerals. Method section is generally centered in the document, and it starts the process of describing the methods that were used to conduct your study. We start with participants and procedures. This is also another heading. This one is not centered. This is generally left justified. This is cool. You know, this learning never ends. It's so much fun. Well, you start by describing your participants. This differs depending on whether you're collecting data yourself or using secondary data. Secondary data are data that are available generally to the public. Sometimes you need IRB, Institutional Review Board approval to collect the data or to use the data. But these are data that have already been collected. Also, that's another lesson right here. Hidden lessons. Data is a plural word. I don't like seeing it as singular because it's not singular. It's data are, not data is. And people do this mistake all the time. It's frustrating. As an associate editor, I actually make them change it, just like I do with relation versus relationship. So since secondary data are coming from a different source, you have all this information available to you. Like who are the participants, how are the data collected, etc. There's like a manual for your secondary data sources. Like say if you're using the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System or YRBSS, you'll have documentation on data. Just describe it. Don't copy and paste. My goodness, because that's a plagiarism here. And I know, by the way, in academic papers for the sciences, this is not like writing for an English paper. We don't use quotations. So we don't quote. You have to paraphrase. So you figure out a way to use your own head to come up with the information as best as possible. We have technology that checks on plagiarism, so we don't like scores that are very high. I like them around less than 10%, definitely. Lower the better. 0% would be ideal, but that's generally not always attainable. But I'll talk about that later some more. So sometimes it's interesting in my students. So this document is for everybody, but I have a course that I'm teaching in Capstone for our public health program, Master's in Public Health program, and a lot of our students are coming up with questions that cannot be answered with existing secondary data, so they're creating their own data sets. And this is really cool because there are a lot of public data available from, for instance, like states have data on, say, homelessness. One of my students is doing homelessness among African Americans and changes in homelessness rates among African Americans during the before and after the pandemic. And we don't have individual level data on people for that, for many reasons, but one of which is it's really difficult to get the homeless people to fill out surveys when they have more important concerns like being homeless. So, but we do have data from states like proportions of homelessness, et cetera. So sometimes you have to put things together from different sources. So sometimes, even though you are using secondary, you have to create your own data set. Some of the sources, you can just download the data directly. Describe how the participants were recruited, any information about the final sample size. So this comes from, how they were recruited comes from documentation that's provided by the data source. If you can, what's your final sample size? So that's interesting because as you prepare your your data set, as you prepare your data set for analysis, you will get to a sample size. Some people have missing data on some variables, so those people will be dropped out by various statistical processes that are used by some of the packages. So you will get a sample size, and you can talk about it really well, of course. Let's see, note certain percentages of participants will not qualify to continue for various reasons, including, just talk about who your participants are. Like, say we collected data on individuals with such and such condition, but what I mean by here is we exclude participants who had comorbid conditions. Like you'll as you read data, if you read documentation of the data set, you'll see that in some cases people were excluded from the data for various reasons. Like if you ever try to participate in a study, sometimes the studies will have criteria and say we can accept people who smoke, but we can't accept people who smoke and have emphysema, or who are smoking and taking varenicline, some medication, right? So there will be exclusion criteria. You have to note those. How the data discuss how the data were acquired. And I mentioned participants may leave the study. All those things have to be discussed because if you're doing research, for instance, using repeated measures data, it means you're measuring people more than once. People tend to leave. That's what we call loss to follow-up. They leave the study for whatever reason. They get bored, they move, sometimes they die. So they're out of the study. So you have to talk about all of that, how the data were acquired. Sometimes people will acquire the data through home visits using some kind of a software like a laptop or a tablet where the survey is completed at school. Just give information so that people understand how the data were collected. By the way, the reason we do this is because we want other researchers to replicate our findings. We want the peer reviewers to verify that we did things correctly, but we also want others to replicate the findings. The more replication we have, the better. Make sure to note that institutional review board approval was given and by whom it was given, by which institution. If you're using secondary data, you may not need, you have to always talk to your institution. You may not need institutional review board approval. The IRB is there to protect participants from harm. However, some data require IRB approval. Like I work on data from the panel study of income dynamics, and they have sensitive data. So for those data, I actually have to get IRB approval from my university in order to have access to the data from the University of Michigan. That's where it's stored. And all that stuff must be noted. Some journals will not publish your study if you didn't get IRB approval. So you can't go around doing studies without IRB approval. And in many cases, the IRB approval was acquired through the parent of the data set. So you have to note that. Another area that you need a heading is instrumentation. This is where you describe what measures were used to assess your variables. If you're measuring a person's weight or a BMI, body mass index, and you use a scale, like a bathroom scale, mention that, what the brand is, what's its validity. You always have to talk about its validity and reliability. If you're using a survey, like say we're talking about vaccine hesitancy, we need to talk about, first of all, how the variable was measured. Like, what did we do? We used a survey that included 20 items or 10 items, etc. We want to talk about that. We have to talk about its reliability or validity. Reliability and validity are important qualities of these measures. Reliability means that there's consistency over time or consistency within the measure. There are different forms of reliability. One that you'll hear a lot about is Cronbach's coefficient alpha, which measures the internal consistency of the measure. And then we also have measures of validity. Validity means that the measure actually does what it was intended or designed to do. It measures what it was designed to measure. So a bathroom scale should measure my weight. There are many different ways we can validate it. If we have one of those old-fashioned bathroom scales, and younger people may not even recognize these, but you used to go to a physician's office, there was a bathroom scale that had a little weight that you would move side to side, slide side to side, very accurate. The way we calibrated those was with like say a 50-pound weight. Just put it on there, it should say 50 pounds. But there's always a way to calibrate everything. So we need documentation on the validity of whatever measure you're using. And these are all available somewhere. They're either available through the data set source if you're using secondary data. If you're collecting data from scratch and you're using an existing measure, they're available. If you created your own measure, then you need to provide information on the validity and reliability of the study from your own analyses. So that's beyond the scope of this paper, but in terms of me explaining what all of these things mean very specifically, so I'm just talking about the formatting of the paper. If you have questions about that, you should definitely talk to your friendly neighborhood statistician. You also have to discuss any control variables, any third variables. Of course, if you have a mediator or a moderator, you need to discuss those as well, how they were measured, any information you need for reliability and validity, and any other variables you're controlling for. Like, even if you're not including them in the analysis as a moderator or mediator, you may be controlling for biological sex, socioeconomic status. Just mention them and how they were measured. Data analysis plan. Every journal varies, or every outcome modality. I don't know what I want to use, because whatever you're writing for has its own criteria for what you should use as headings. Data analysis plan could be its own heading underneath, following from, well, within the method section certainly, but following after the measures or instrumentation, right? Or it could be a subheading of some sort. But you definitely need to talk about what you're doing. Like here's an example. We will analyze the data with multiple regression analysis to test for moderation. We will include a product term, multiplying sex by public service announcement viewing. We will also control for the following demographic variables: ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and political affiliation. So here I'm talking about that I'm going to analyze the data using multiple regression analysis. When we're using a simple, it may not be simple for some of you because I do stats a lot, but in the world of research, multiple regression analysis is a known type of analysis. So I don't have to go in and start talking about how we estimate parameters and all that stuff. But because most people know what multiple regression is, most of your peers will know it. Anybody in research, they can find out what it is. If I'm dealing with something more complicated like structural equation modeling that people don't know about, we need to talk about it more and this section would be a lot longer than what I have written here. Results. So I do, again, results is another heading that would be centered. Again, without the Roman or numerals, remember that. Without the Roman numerals, it'd be centered. Usually it's bold, could be all caps depending on the rules of your journal or whatever your output is, source is. When I talk about results, I always start with descriptive statistics. So you want to describe the sample. This isn't the same as what when we talked about what variables we're measuring in the method section. Here I actually conducted the analysis. I have my final counts, and I'm going to talk about who's in my sample, like what proportion of males, what proportion by ethnicity, number and proportion. Usually you'll have a table of some sort for this, a descriptive statistics table. In my courses, I teach my students how to create these. So I would look up, if you aren't one of my students, what a descriptive statistics table would be like and put it in there. I don't think I have one in here, do I? Nope. Yeah, what a descriptive statistics table would look like. But it generally has proportion, frequency and proportion for categorical variables, so means and standard deviation for continuous variables. And I'd reference it, and then I'd pull out certain important ones, like for instance, biological sex in this faux study of mine is an important variable. So I'll say something like participants with 55% male. By the way, when there's a binary outcome like male versus female, you don't have to say 55% male, 45% female. That's known because the sample space can only comprise 100% of all values. So either you're male or female, so 100 minus 55 is 45. So we know what proportion female there is, or there are. Let's see. So, but that shouldn't be a lot. What you don't want to do is you don't want to write everything. Like I said, don't note that the text must not mirror the table. So you don't have the exact same information in the table as you do in the text. Otherwise, why have the table? Just text highlight what you need them to see as a result. Then refer to the table so they can look at the rest. Provide the results of the main analysis. It depends on what you're doing. If I'm doing structural equation analysis, I'll say multivariate results, multivariate analysis. You can have main analysis, you can have regression analysis if you're doing regression, some kind of a subheading there. So here, this is, you see I put this in bold, that means it's important. You cannot discuss any findings here. No discussion, nothing. Just give me the data results. So include p-values and confidence intervals, effect sizes, things like that. We like effect sizes because there's controversy about p-values and this null hypothesis significance testing. There's controversy about it. Some people don't like it because we rely on, and I'm just using language here that I'm assuming you know, we rely on alphas that are set by researchers. So it's kind of, we're not really trusting it anymore like we used to. So we provide additional information like confidence intervals and effect sizes as well. So that would go in there, but no discussion. Discussion's left for the discussion section. In this section, and again, this is another one where discussion is centered. Okay, and I didn't center it here because I wanted to keep this in a in the form of an outline, but this should be centered and bold again. And again, like I said, it could be all caps or not. In this section, you discuss the most interesting findings. Not every finding. Again, let me repeat that. You discuss the most interesting findings. So you're not going to discuss word for word or line for line what you found in this, in the research, in the results section. I mean, if you had a hypothesis that was supported, yes, I'd say, wow, we found support for our hypothesis. But do not repeat the results. Also, do not overreach. What I mean is, like, you found one little thing and now you have a solution for the whole world and all the problems of the world. People tend to do that because they get real excited about their findings. So be careful. Do not take what some of my colleagues used to call a conceptual leap of faith, right? What you found is what you found. use very tentative language. So you can use words like perhaps, though, and can write something like these data suggest. Notice how it's plural, right? These data suggest a negative relation. Notice relation instead of relationship between public service announcement viewing and vaccine hesitancy. Although speculative at this point, if I'm going to make a statement, it's not in stone. And believe me, if you're alive now and watching this, you've seen how people speculate on stuff regarding the coronavirus, and they take it as truth. In science, we can't do that. It's about gathering information. You can make some speculations, but it's like a warning, this is speculation. Although speculative at this point, perhaps, I'm doing my best I can to make sure that they know that this isn't real. I'm just hypothesizing at this time. Perhaps increasing the number of public service ads and their breadth could increase the likelihood of the vaccine hesitant to get vaccinated. However, the finding that the effect is stronger for females than males may indicate that ads need to better target male audiences. Future studies with larger samples are needed. This should always be in your discussion. Are needed to verify our findings. Future studies should also explore diversity of public service announcements, including announcements that may appeal more to males. So that's an important statement that explains. It's kind of like telling people, look, this is good news, but it's only one piece of news, and we need to study this more. So we may be finding something, but let's wait and see. So it's very, very tentative. Limitations. You always have to discuss the limitations. So I didn't put this under headings, although some journals may have a heading for limitations, but I'm not doing that here. So limitations is like, what's wrong with your study? Why can't we be 100% certain? Well, there's some limitations that you should always discuss. If it's secondary data analysis, may mention that. With a secondary data analysis, you didn't design the study, you didn't collect the data, so you didn't have access to the variables that you truly want to measure. Use what are called proxy variables, the best possible matches to what you're interested in measuring. So another limitation can be sample size. If your sample size is too small, you should mention that. Small sample sizes lack power. So, and again, I'm assuming that you understand what power is. Power is the probability of rejecting a false null hypothesis. I'm hoping you understand that. Wrap up your discussion with a conclusion, generally a sentence or two at the most. Do not repeat what was already said. All right, so let's talk about the last section here is references. This is where you list your references. In public health, we use APA, American Psychological Association style, right? APA style, which is listing your references in alphabetical order. We don't not use numbering in APA style. However, in medical journals and other public health journals, you may have variation in style. Some use numberings. Just follow whatever style your source requires. Your output source. I gotta find a better word for that. Your task demands. How about that? That's better, right? Let's talk a little bit about citing sources. This is my favorite topic. So I'm going to go over this because this is like where people struggle the most at all levels. It's only that once in a while you get this click, this light going off in people's heads, and all of a sudden they do it correctly. But it's something that's difficult for many reasons. So hopefully I can cover all of it. So whenever we write about something, there's probably a tremendous number of studies done on it. A tremendous number. I'll give you an example. So I did a Google search. I used Google Scholar. I should say Google Scholar search for vaccine hesitancy since 2021, right? It's just turned 2022 today, right? I found 7,630 articles. You want me to repeat that again? 7,630 articles. This is sources. They may or may not be. It depends on what you include in your search, but that's a lot of sources, right? Potential sources. You got that? This is since 1 year. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in COVID, and there's a lot of interest in vaccine hesitancy. People are trying to do research all over the world, whether in the United States, China, Senegal, Argentina, wherever. You know, people are doing research on this, and it's interesting. I can't cite all 7,630 articles in my paper, but I can't just cite one. And what I see in lower end writers is this inability to bring together the information from all these sources and write simple sentences. Here's an example. Vaccine hesitancy is a problem that impacts the willingness of adults to vaccinate against SARS coronavirus 2 and is particularly prevalent among ethnic minority populations. So when I looked at those 7,630 articles, I just read through a few of them quickly, and a couple of things I noted. Well, just these three are sources that already discussed what vaccine hesitancy is, so I can use those as sources because, hey, I didn't come up with the idea of vaccine hesitancy, and I cannot claim that I did. People have been working on this, so I need to show my reader that I didn't come up with this information. These other individuals did. Maybe it's not these specific ones, but they certainly did it before I did it. They're already published. And in reading, it's interesting, in reading through these first few articles, I noticed this issue of differences by ethnic minority groups, where there's a lower or a higher vaccine hesitancy among ethnic minority groups. So I included that in here, and is particularly prevalent because that's something I found out while I was reading. Remember what I said earlier, that as you're reading, you might find new information, you may alter your hypotheses. Finding this means maybe I will do something different instead of just doing a moderation by sex. I might also use moderation by one's ethnicity. And here's the more important thing that differentiates a more mature academic writer from a less mature. And please don't take this to mean that anything qualitatively wrong with you. As a skier, I ski a lot, right? And I teach skiing. Even though to a beginner, I will look like an expert. When I compare myself to really good skiers, I'm at the beginner end because I can't ski as well as they can ski. Like the really, really, truly good skiers. You have to be able to accept that we have flaws as humans, but you have to want to remedy those flaws. That's what makes us a great academic, is one who wants to become better, right? And that's what I want to do, and I want you to become better. So I say I'm not shy to cite multiple authors. It's kind of a joke here because you have to. So here I cited 1, 2, 3 different sources. I could have cited 7,000, whatever I said before, that large number. But if you notice, APA style is cumbersome. You have to put a number of authors. I think you can go up to like 5 authors or so, and where you'd list them, and then you do et al. If there's more than that, et al. And the rest, right? Like if I use this source again, the second time I do AWA et al. 2021, because it's so cumbersome, it's so long. If you know anything about grant writing, we use numbering because it's a lot more efficient. But here it's not, so I can't cite too many, but I can't just cite one. If I'm citing one source, I'm looked upon as an ineffective scholar. You have to have more than one source when you make statements like this. Let's see, how many citations are enough? Well, it depends again on what sources you use. I try to find the most relevant ones. If I find several good sources, I'm happy. If you have a review article, that is good too, because especially if you have some kind of a systematic review or a meta-analysis, these papers are really good. You can use those. And it doesn't mean you can't use one source sporadically. I have this rule for my courses that 80% of your sites should have multiple sources. your citing instances should include more than one reference. You can have some where there's only one, because sometimes there's only one study that looked at something, or for whatever. It could be in your method section, right, where you're talking about the validity. Think there's only one study. That's fine, but the majority of cases you should have more than one. And here I have my references listed. For this I used some software that's why it lights up when I press it. I use software called EndNote. EndNote actually is cool because it allows me to just enter sources in a specific style. So if I go to EndNote, the styles are available for each journal that I'm using. And so for instance here I said, let's see, you can see up here my references are an APA 6th edition, but I can change that to some other specific journal, like American Journal of Public Health, and it would change. Notice how it changed it? Let's see where the references were, where I used them. Look at that. See, it changed them to numbering. Isn't that cool? If you're doing a lot of writing, you should definitely get EndNote or some other software, because this is a lot of work to do by hand, and EndNote will do it all for you. Just one more point about this idea of citing multiple sources. I used to have this term I called serial citing, not like cereal that you eat, but cereal as in a series. And it caused a lot of confusion, and one of my students was like, I had no idea what he was talking about. It was serial citing. What does that mean? Well, what I mean by serial citing is something that I see in the least of the mature academic writer. And this is nothing abnormal with this. This is how our brain works. When I read an article, I want to discuss that article in full to make sure I give that article full credit, right? And so at the least mature level of academic writing, people start by writing about the first article. They finish that, I'm done. Now let me write about the second article. And in this way, they're building their case. Due to space limitations in publication, that's impossible. So what we have come up with is a more efficient way of writing, and this example is a more efficient way of writing. You'll notice that I covered 3 different sources within one sentence. So instead of discussing this article first, then the Razai article, and then the Salam article, 3 different sources, and maybe doing that over 2 pages, I used one sentence to cover everything. So instead of doing it in a series, one article after the other, we use this more mature way of writing, which is summarizing ideas that are covered, that are shared by multiple sources into a single sentence. Now, how does one do that? Well, here's my remedy, because we also want to avoid plagiarism. And a lot of plagiarism is unintentional, because people don't know. They're just trying to be, in fact, they're trying to be good, but by being good, they're being bad. And then you're not really being bad, but they're getting high plagiarism scores. What you do is you read the articles. You can take notes. You can do whatever you like. Read the articles, get to know them, put them away. Do not have access to them at all. Now start writing the paper. Do not fill in citations at all while you're writing. So I could write this sentence: vaccine hesitancy is a problem that impacts the willingness of adults to vaccinate against SARS coronavirus 2, and is particularly prevalent among ethnic minorities, because that's what I remember from reading. Now I go back and look at which sources fit that. So that's different. You understand that difference? It's very, very different. And here's the beauty of that. When I remember what I read, I don't just remember it verbatim, right, word for word. All of my history as a human being, as a person, as whatever I am, mixes in together with that which I read. And what comes out is something that's unique to me. You get that? That's beautiful. That is the beauty of writing. What comes in, so imagine that I read all that. Just visualize this. I use imagery a lot. Visualize it. You're like a vacuum. You're vacuuming in all this knowledge. then it goes inside your brain and gets mixed in with everything else in your brain, like from your history. And when you write it or you type it, it comes out as your unique piece. It's like your fingerprint. It's unique. You want to reduce your plagiarism scores? Do that. But practice. It's like when I want to improve my skiing, I go out and I spend hours practicing these drills that are painful. I'd rather just go fast and be bad at skiing. But to be good, I have to practice until it hurts. That's the same thing you need to do, okay? That's the last thing I want to say, and I hope everybody has a wonderful New Year. Thank you very much for listening to me.